Good morning and welcome to the second of EMPA's free pre-conference webinars. The webinar is a result of a major work by our EMPA community, the development of the EMPA principles. EMPA Director Rebecca Riggs coordinated a massive collaboration process to develop our 7 principles, and one of which is building teams, creating the capacity to do our work under whatever conditions are thrown at us, because we have the teams that work well and can scale up easily. So we're talking about that today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. I'm coming to you from Waka Waka country in Queensland, west of Brisbane, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all First Nations people. I'm joining you today from also the lands of the Jagera, Guyabal and Jaraware people within that Waka Waka Nation. If you've attended a previous EMPA webinar or used the Zoom platform, you should be familiar with the various controls and buttons on your screen. So jump on the chat panel down the bottom at any time to talk to the panelists and to follow your fellow participants. You can talk with individual participants by selecting who you're talking to in the blue button at the bottom. Just make sure that you have everyone selected if you want everyone to see your comment. After the facilitated discussion today, there'll be a Q&A session. So type your questions into the Q&A panel or the chat session at any time during the webinar for the presenters to answer live or at the end of the panel. If you have any issues or questions and can't access the chat, just shoot us an email through to conferences@empa.org.au. So without further ado, we will hand over now to Rebecca Riggs, who will facilitate today's webinar.
Thanks very much, Barbara. Welcome to you all and welcome to our incredible participants in the conversation today. Without a doubt, we all know that in 2022, if we didn't know before today, we know now that the work that we do requires ongoing commitment, capacity, energy, and we need to look for the very best ways that we can build scalable teams and give them capacity, tools, leadership, support, look after them so that they are okay even in the midst of things not being okay. We also need to accept that sometimes any of us may well not be okay, and we need policy and process and culture that can respond to that as well. So those are some of the things that we're going to be discussing today. I'd love to introduce you to our 3 experts who've worked in and led teams in tricky and challenging times. Chantelle Murphy, who's from Queensland's QFES. Karl Ferguson, Department of Health, New Zealand. And Sascha Rundle, who's worked at ABC, worked at the BOM and now works as an independent consultant. I think the perspectives that they're going to bring to the conversation are going to be incredible. So welcome to the 3 of you. Feel free to now turn on your mics and cameras, and let's start the conversation. At the moment, I can only see you, Sascha, so I'm going to ask you a question first.
Go for it.
Look, without a doubt, we know this. Building surge capacity isn't easy because you've got the reality of a business as usual organisation, no matter who you work for, and then these other times where the needs skyrocket. What systems or agreements have you worked with that have helped you enable that surge capacity?
I think the one that goes to the very heart of the issue is making sure that you're having the discussions well in advance of whatever the disaster or the situation is. We all know what it's like to work in the flurry of an emergency or the flurry of a crisis. That's not really the best time to be making the plans. Sometimes you do need to make plans on the hop, but ideally, in order for every single person of that team to be as well prepared as possible, you need to start having the conversations months in advance, looking at what skills and what roles will be needed in your team when that emergency hits, working out who might be willing and able, who's interested in being a part of that team, who would not normally be a part of that team. And the way I would always look at it is plan for the worst situation, but hope for the best. Because when you're in the flurry of an instant emergency, you can't just make the plans on the hop. That's really going to put so much pressure onto so many different people. So looking at who's interested, who expresses an interest, who says, oh, yes, I've never done that work, but I might be able to help you. And then looking at the skills that that person can bring, because not only will you find that their skills will match the skills that you're after, but they might have other skills that your current team doesn't already possess. And those new skills will really, really help you in advance. I think the other crucial thing to look at is making certain right from the outset that everyone is going to have a clearly defined period of work and, more importantly, a clearly defined period of rest. We will all be able to function best and be true to our roles, be true to our community, and be true to ourselves as individuals if we are well rested and are able to step away, or as my team has previously told me, take time to get off the roller coaster, to know that now's the time to get off the roller coaster, someone else will replace you and you can step down and that new person can be guided and supported.
And that changes the resourcing needs as well. You're not just looking at enough people to do the job, you're looking at enough people to do the job while some other people are resting.
Absolutely. And to know that people, when they're resting, they're not going to be disturbed. The thing I would always tell my team was, when you are resting, I would hope that you can put your phone in your sock drawer, because that means that you're not going to be looking at it. You're not going to be turning on the news and finding out the latest in that emergency. You're going to be trusting others to do that. And as a manager, I repeatedly had to turn off my phone. Even in the most heightened situations, we had to take time for ourselves, and that includes rest breaks. And if you think of our normal day-to-day job, how often do we actually take that 1 hour lunch break? Probably not very often, but in an emergency situation, it's all the more crucial that you do that. In fact, during the 2019-20 bushfires, I remember on a crucial day, we had just reached, I think, 6 emergency warnings in New South Wales for bushfires. And at that point, my 2IC said, Sascha, we've got 6 new emergency warnings. I think that's currently a new record. It's time for me to take a lunch break. And I said, yes, Jen, absolutely good idea. You can always take a break, and you should always take a break, leaving others to handle that work.
Sascha, do you think these lessons learned are both in our culture, in our plans? Are they inside the systems that we work in, or are they lessons that we keep learning again and again and again?
I think definitely the latter, Beck. Okay. If you think of people in comms roles, many people come from backgrounds as journalists or working in the media. And the media, speaking as a former member of the media is a horrible environment in terms of self-care and in terms of promoting the need for people to look after themselves. There have been great improvements over the last 10 years, but the media, and I would say the comms area, is still learning the lessons. So instinctively, we have that already. Gee, I've got to keep working. I've got to get that story. I've got to write that media release. I've got to make sure that that social media post is out there. So you've got that instinctive sense that you have to keep on working. That's almost built into the industry in which we work. But then comes the flurry of the emergency and the adrenaline rush. And that also tends to push aside those feelings of, wait a second, I've got to work in the right way. And that means I need to take time to have a drink of water, to take time out from looking at emails and taking phone calls. So it's really important that we all as individuals, whether you're a team member, a team manager, stop, pause. And I know a great mentor of mine used to say, you always have 1 minute. You've got 1 minute to stop, to think about what needs to happen and the right way to approach it and how everyone can play their part.
Karl and Chantelle, I've seen you nodding along. I'm really interested to know if you've experienced some really good systems, some really good plans. Are we starting to build a kind of structure that enables us to do what we know we need to do to survive and do our jobs really well? Who would like to answer? Chantelle?
Yeah, I think we definitely are. And unfortunately, the thing about learning lessons is you kind of need to go through and experience yourself to get the full benefit of knowing what those lessons need to be and preventing them from happening again. So I know for our team, we've got quite a few members of our team that have been with us for a very long time now and have been through a lot of large-scale incidents under a lot of pressure. So we have the benefit of having made tons of mistakes over many, many years to come to some really good lessons. And just like Sascha was saying, those lessons are learnt in the heat of the moment, but you start implementing them the minute that incident finishes. And that goes all the way back to the foundation of your team. So even when you're recruiting people to be in the positions you need them to be in, looking at things like fit for a team is so vitally important because many of us work in relatively small teams. And I like to think of it a bit like some of the frontline teams. You're with these people day after day, year after year, season after season. You go through some really tough stuff together as well. And you kind of foster this bit of a family. And when you have that more family environment where you're all looking out for each other, you're all supporting each other, then you do understand those stress points, you can recognise them a lot more easily and you can react to them really well and strongly as well. So as Sascha was saying, you know, making sure that people are having breaks, making sure that people feel comfortable in saying, you know what, this is a lot for me right now and I'm not sure what to do, but I want to keep going because otherwise the person next to me is going to fall down. Recognising that those are issues within your team is really important to keep your team going. And so we've had to implement a lot of very hard boundaries, I guess, outside of incidents to set an expectation of this is how we will treat you, whether it's an incident or not an incident. So there are things like making sure people aren't working too long, making sure people do have breaks, making sure there's flexibility in the work that we do and adaptability, but there's also a really good process and procedures behind things so that people aren't guessing what they're doing all the time. So finding the balance of the structure, finding the balance of who you need and the skill set that you need, and the personalities and the fit in your team all need to be considered right from the beginning, and then fostered that entire way through to the incident and then after the incident, and we go around again.
Yeah, and I've always thought that structure is our friend as long as we can be flexible as well. Karl, I actually remember at the very beginning, the very first conversation we had on the principles, you were talking about who are the right people, how to find the right people for these teams, and not only the teams that are going to do the job 365 days a year, but how do you find those right people in maybe the marketing team or somewhere else in the organisation? Tell me the lessons that you've learnt around that, and any wisdom you have from managers out there. How do you find those right people and how do you make sure they're interested in helping us?
It's a good question, and kia ora koutou everyone. Ko Karl Ferguson, taka unga no pōneki a hou. So just in the spirit of Barb's very generous welcome, so that's just a little bit of te reo from a pretty grey and foggy Wellington across the Tasman. So a little bit later in the day here, just about lunchtime. So I hope not too, hope your mornings are going well. And look, really appreciate, Sascha, Chantelle, your observations. They really resonate with me. And I think probably just coming back to your question, Rebecca, in terms of lessons learned. So in my experience, and it is a slight, obviously the jurisdictions within New Zealand are slightly different. But certainly when I was looking after the communications and engagement function in Auckland Council, and it was a comparatively large and well-resourced function, in relation to local government in the New Zealand context, so over 100 staff, we had quite a formal structure around how we resourced and supported emergency responses. And so by that I mean, in my leadership team, I had a senior leader at a GM level who was responsible for the function. And she essentially established a parallel structure drawn from that wider group of what we call PIM, public information managers and responders. And it really was, just coming back to your point, Rebecca, it was self-selecting. So people were encouraged and invited to participate and put their hand up. But we did also look at the key roles we needed and then draw from that, the specialist skills, for example, social media or channels management, media, public affairs, etc. But the other sort of things I think are probably worth commenting on or referencing, one, we had a kind of an informal but well-supported PIM club. So that group would meet regularly, at least once a month, to talk about best practice and to talk about honing people's skills. The other thing I think is really important, just coming back to that sort of thinking around well-being, is although those staff sat within a centralised comms and engagement function, in terms of the overall culture of the organisation, the emergency management group was progressive and mature, and they really understood the value of communications and engagement in a response. They're incredibly supportive of our PIM people and team. And in terms of the kind of well-being points, the overall approach to well-being was largely dictated or informed by the way they looked after their own people. So they did that really well, and they saw our people as their people, and all of the things that you put in place, would be considered best practice to ensure well-being, like rostering, people being able to put their phone away on a day off. All of that was really well supported and acknowledged, and a priority within that context.
First of all, for everybody that is listening, you all would have been sent out a principles document, a link to it, and there's also a link in the chat. But for anybody who hasn't read this specific principle, I'm just going to share it with you now. It's the final principle, but I don't think that's because it was the also ran. In essence, it was, if all of that, then what? And number 7, therefore, was building teams, creating capacity. And it starts with the sentence that we all know, there is much to be done. We need to resource and build scalable and adaptable teams of skilled communication practitioners. We need to prepare them, build their capacity, and work to ensure their well-being. So we've actually been talking around all of those aspects. But one that I'm interested in hearing from each of you, what's standing in the way of us doing that better? And what can we do to improve? Who'd like to start? Karl, let's go in the other direction.
Well, it's probably a bit unhelpful, Rebecca, because I agree with your principle, but I think, just coming back to, the idea of surge and scalability, I felt we were really well kind of set up in that Auckland Council context, and we were often called upon, by other regions throughout New Zealand to, loan people in response to an event, and they happen frequently. And I think, the council team built a really strong reputation nationally for being, highly responsive and highly skilled. It's not to say that the model is perfect. And as I said, comparatively in the New Zealand context, we were able to draw from a large resource pool. At a kind of a central government or national level, we've also put in practice since there were a number of things that prompted this: the Christchurch earthquake, Canterbury fires, a number of events that prompted a kind of more structured central government response, where there would be key communication staff, what we call all of government communications managers, dispatched to support events that were considered to be nationally significant. So again, a corresponding or complementary central government structure to support that local home response. The one thing I would say though, which is potentially back to your question of barriers, it's incredible, and this won't come as a surprise to anyone on the call, but in this space of communications engagement, we do tend to have really high turnover of key people. And it's incredible how quickly kind of institutional knowledge and practice can be lost. And, one person can leave from a key role. There isn't a significant event for 6 or 12 months. The new person isn't really familiar with what happened and the way it worked. And, there can be a bit of a scramble where the phones are going saying, hey, but we thought, and they're like, oh, do we? And, some of those well-learned, good, sensible practices can quite quickly be lost if they aren't regularly kind of exercised and prioritised.
Yeah, that sounds right to me too. Chantelle, Sascha, any other thoughts about barriers?
I know for us, time and money, I think that is a barrier for everyone, everywhere, time and money. So what we need to do is be realistic about what we can achieve. And as it's already been said a couple of times, making sure that our stakeholders understand in an emergency, these are the resources we have, this is what's going to happen, and that's all that we're going to be able to do, is really important conversation for us to have. Because what we found, particularly in our first big bushfire season here in Queensland, so I'm speaking from Queensland Fire and Emergency Services, and at the time, our team was responsible for not only managing media, but also managing bushfire warnings and putting those out. And I think there was an enormous underestimation about the resourcing that would be required to do that. And what we found happened was that everyone just expected everything to continue as it normally would, even though we had a really high demand. So the lesson we learned from that experience was to speak up and say, actually, we can't do all of the things you're expecting us to do. So what we did was we clearly outlined our business continuity plan and put in percentages for when we have full staffing, part staffing, if people are on fatigue, if people are, and they need to have these fatigue leave days. They need to stand down. We're operating 24/7. The model changes very quickly, and I don't think everyone takes that into account, particularly if you're working in an organisation where perhaps your communications people aren't wearing uniforms. So there's not an automatic assumption that this is a 24/7 operation, 365. And so I think the lesson is, don't assume that everyone knows what your capacity is, that the expectation may be higher, and that you need to clearly define what you're going to be able to achieve and what you're not going to be able to achieve. Whether you have scalability or not, make sure that is well laid out, and then look for ways to problem solve and get people on board, those stakeholders on board, that can help you get to maybe those stretch outcomes that you're looking for. look to other departments to try and achieve some of that as well. So that you're not burning your own people out, because that has to become first and foremost, is the well-being of your own people. You're not going to be able to do anything well if the people that are there are burnt out.
I think this relates to some of the things that were being said at our last webinar about the principles, about the seat at the table, which is that we need to probably, I think, as a cohort, get better at advocating the communication realities and have really good documented processes to show other parts of our organisations, so that we can say, we have thought this through, this is what is possible, this is what is not, this is how we do our job, all those really concrete things that we actually probably all know, but other people do not. I think there's massive value in that. I can see you nodding, Sascha.
Oh,
yes,
sorry,
I was going to say,
quickly to that. I think that starts in the debrief. So you don't wait until next time. If you've had the event and things haven't gone to plan, you start talking about it in your debrief. So even for the floods that we've just had here in Queensland, our team's already had their own debrief, and we are taking what we picked up in there to the organisation for the wider debrief at an organisational level. So making sure you have that conversation is important.
Yeah, so that we don't just improve our own processes, but influence other ones. Sascha?
I think when we're talking about processes, it is so important to have consistent and agreed upon processes well before the emergency. And that's where you can start to work with your stakeholders, your partners, even your customers, to develop those approaches, to have that agreed approach months, years in advance of that emergency. In terms of the question, what's getting in the way? Time and money, absolutely, Chantelle, I agree with you. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to wave a magic wand and suddenly we've got twice as many staff and 3 times as much budget? We all know, unfortunately, that isn't possible. But I think what is getting in the way is also us prioritising the planning and prioritising the practice. When we are bringing in people from other teams, how often do we practice in advance? How often do we put aside our day-to-day tasks, which can be all-consuming, and say, I know we're busy, but we really need to practice how we're going to work together in a major event, or in a black swan event, or an event that is so great that we cannot currently even imagine it. We need to do more practice, and I think the daily demands of need to get this statement approved, need to look at whatever the comms task is, that can often get in the way. But the more we practice and come together, and then, as Chantelle says, learn from our mistakes, learn from that practice, learn from that stakeholder exercise, learn from that debrief, and put those new suggestions into place before the next emergency. That is really going to help. The other thing I think that we can do better at is having those leaders actually leading by example. We need to have the leaders absolutely engaged in the process, to be knowing that, yes, we have agreed to do this. Here's the consistent approach, but we may need to change it for this scenario. We may need to tweak it here because that community needs something more. They need something different. And the leaders need to be able to lead by example and to guide teams through that approach, including those members of the team who might be taking part in that emergency comms event for the very first time. So to guide them into why we're adapting from those consistent principles and that previously agreed approach.
I have a question in the chat, which is how to apply all of this into organisations where there are a lot of volunteers. So the question is, what are your thoughts and considerations about resource planning arrangements when responding emergency management services are volunteer-based without reliance of large-scale interstate commitment? It's tricky, isn't it? Everything gets more tricky when you're working with and supporting volunteers. Having said that, we couldn't do what we do without them. So how do we support them? and how do we work with them to be as well planned as we can?
I'm going to speak both as a volunteer and as someone who has worked with volunteers. So, for example, I'm a surf lifesaver, and I was recently involved in frontline operations as part of the current and still ongoing flood situation in New South Wales. Now, surf lifesaving, like SES, like the fire agencies, there are so many amazing volunteers. But I think what drives someone to take part in volunteer work for the community is their sense to help, others, and also their sense of I guess adventure might be part of it. You know, people do extra work because they love it. They love the experiences. They love working together in their teams. Doesn't matter if you're paid or volunteer, you've got that wonderful sense of teamwork. So again, in advance of any volunteer being looped in, how can we appeal to what it is that drives volunteers to be there in the first place? And I know already in surf lifesaving, from the recent experiences, we're having conversations which start along the lines of, this person was involved in the flood work and this is what they got out of it. This is what it meant to them. And any other volunteer can see, wow, that was really an incredible process. How can we learn from them? What happened? What steps did they go through, and how can we educate a broader group of volunteers so that if they suddenly find themselves in that situation, they know what to do? And it's practicing in little groups, whether it's the volunteer units or the bigger groups, it's that practice. And even in those smaller units, practicing can help when you're in a major situation.
Mm.
Mm. I think also being really flexible when it comes to volunteers as well. So people in their volunteering capacity are going to have a range of different skills and availability, and they're going to be all over the place. One of the great things about our organisation is that anyone in our organisation has the ability to speak to the media within their scope of responsibility, and that means they have access to speaking to their community on really broad platforms. Lots of our volunteers also run their own social media pages in their own local brigades and units, and so we look at ways that we can support those activities by putting in some policies and guidelines that will make them feel supported, but also give them the scope to speak to their communities, because we all know that our end goal here is to do what's right for the community. The community needs to hear from their local community, and so it just makes sense that we're supporting those people to do what they need to do. And so not every interview request needs the commissioner. It doesn't need the assistant commissioner. A lot of the time, it needs the person that's doing the rescues. It needs the person that's in the ICC, that knows the local roads that are cut. So empowering those people to be able to do those activities, those community engagement activities, is really important as well. And with the restrictions on time to undertake training, you do sometimes have to do a bit of that on the fly. So we have little pocket guides that are available to everyone in our organisation that have a little checklist of, this is how you kind of stay on track if you're talking to the media, and these are some things that we suggest you stay away from. If you're ever concerned, pick up a phone, give us a call. We'll give you a couple of pointers over the phone and some guidance. And so being informal in those respects can be really helpful at times. I know it goes away from some of that structure, but like we're saying, you do need to be adaptable in your approach and flexible, and accept that, you know, it may not end up being the best interview in the world, but I've been here at QFES for 15 years now, and not a single thing anyone has ever said has brought down this organisation. So,
look, I think it's a really interesting change that's happening, an acknowledgement that we can't hold everything. You know, that we are, you know, and this is probably a fairly scary thing to say, but I think we have said single point of truth so often that we forget that accurate information is what we want. We must acknowledge that other people are speaking and other people are asking questions. And if we empower them and share good information with them, we are enabling messages to get to where they need to go.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting shift in the way people are talking about the work we do. Karl, do you want to speak into this? I've got a few more questions coming through the chat, but I want to let everybody sort of talk about this issue of how do we empower and support volunteers.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. And look, I do have two further thoughts on that. And the first one's slightly tangential, but I'm mindful when there is an emergency event at a community level, the community want to be involved more often than not. They aren't happy to sit back and let the experts do it. They want to feel that they can contribute meaningfully. So I think volunteers have a really critical role to play. And I know that's not specific to what we're talking about here, but thinking about your response and how you can involve members of the community in a volunteer capacity, I think is a really important principle around event response. I think the second point I'd make, and it comes back to some of the earlier comments, particularly about surf lifesaving, is what brings people back is, in my experience, is the sense of being valued. And and that's a real challenge, I think, in this space. And it kind of comes back to the culture of the emergency management function you're working with, or the organizational culture. But if people understand the critical role that communications, public affairs play in response to an emergency management event, and that is acknowledged and valued at a leadership level, then I think volunteers can be really effective, because you get the best from people when they feel that the work they're doing really matters and that's acknowledged.
This links to a question in the chat, which is about assumptions that can be made between the civilian employees versus those in uniform. A lot of, if we're talking about upscaling, we bring together people with different perspectives, volunteers, not volunteers, marketing versus comms. Well, and I put the word versus in. There should be no versus. How do we take the versus out of this? How do we, as leaders in the comms space, tell a story of a sort of a unified process? How do we create a unified process? How do we deal with those differences? And I guess also connected to this question in the chat, how do we share that story into the rest of our organizations? Because it can be one thing in the comms team, but it might feel very different outside the comms team. So that's a big question. Put your hand up if you want to go first.
I can.
Okay, go Chantelle.
Yeah. So we do experience this a lot in our organisation, I think, because it's so broad. We've got paid people in uniform, volunteers in uniforms, we've got paid people out of uniforms. So I think the key to this that we have found is playing to people's strengths. So I know that a firefighter can tell a story fantastically that they have been part of, and they're happy to do that. They want to be part of the community. They're passionate. There's no point in me putting them in front of a computer screen and asking them to publish an emergency alert for me. It's just not what they're going to be comfortable with doing. It takes a lot of time to teach them that process. They can't maintain that skill in their BAU at all. So I am better placed to make sure that people within my own team can do that really quickly, and have people who are finding stories and telling stories to be doing that bit as well. So from a very practical sense, if we take the example of trying to push proactive work that we're doing in an emergency or spread a community message, then that will start from a central point in our team, contacting public information officer in a region, and that person may be called in off other duties that they had been doing into that role. Now, they're not going to be able to do all of the comm stuff that we need them to do, but they have a lot of connections out in the field. They can find good stories that are happening. They can tell us about those stories. we can help them liaise with media and we can push all that out that way. So it's playing to the strengths of people rather than trying to expect people in a scalable team to be able to do every single task from beginning to end. We don't need that. We need lots of people that can do parts of things rather than lots of people that can do everything.
And plan accordingly so that we
Absolutely.
know who our potential people are. Yeah.
Yeah.
We really know, and we give them tasks to fit them. Any other thoughts, Karl and Sascha?
Oh, just really quickly, I think, Chantelle, you did an excellent job of commenting on that. I really had very little to add other than to say, and I think it's consistent with the earlier kind of topic, which is, you know, who are you going to draw upon from your team? And I think it's just, particularly with volunteers, you know, does the ambition meet the reality? You know, so are they actually able to, you know, be available? What's their kind of personal situation? So I think you just have to test with people in that volunteer space a little bit more the, you know, the reality of what might be needed if they're being asked to, you know, come into an emergency response, and you can be assured you'll be able to get that commitment and that they have the right skills.
And also asking people regularly, what do you need in order to be able to do this role? Because some people may feel reluctant to put their hand up and say, I'm a bit uncertain, I'm doing this role for the first time and I'm used to doing that. But I think the more we can ask people, what do you need? What's going to help make your role better or make your life better as you are doing the important job of helping the community?
It's a really, sorry, you go.
Oh, so I was just going to say, and I've seen this work really well in certain circumstances, if the employer of the person is supportive of this work and they're volunteering, and that's kind of agreed up front, that really helps for people. So that's another thought.
I've got a couple of other remarks here. I might leave that one to the end. An effective corporate communications or crisis communications team can be a useful bridge between operational and strategic decision makers. Seat at the table, I say. By asking the right questions, you can assist in joining the dots and supporting a cohesive response. Also have a uniformed member on your team if you're working in a uniformed organisation. Their perspective will be useful to you. I think that's a really interesting comment. I've always thought that one of the real powers of communicators was to bring information into organisations as opposed to just share it out. I think we are well placed to do that. Anybody else can comment on that if you like. But what about the idea of getting a uniformed person into a comms team?
I think the more you have the interests of stakeholders covered as well, and the more you can learn from different parts of your organisation, the stronger the organisation will be. So that's looking at, again, the stakeholders, any partners, any customers. When you're able to see the perspective of each of those positions, I think it's going to enhance the overall team.
Something that I'm picking up from a lot of the things you've been saying is you know, what makes a good leader in these sorts of teams. So I'd just like to ask each of you about a leader that really comes to mind for you. I love the leadership question that you mentioned, Sascha. What do you need? In fact, my manager at the moment asks that periodically, and it is a very powerful question. But what else has really made a difference for you from leaders that you've worked with that we can grab hold of and use on tricky days?
I think for me, if I think back to the strongest managers that I've had and the ones where I've felt supported, it's knowing that when I come to them with a particular problem, they're going to be ready to listen. I'm not going to bother them with every problem. So there's that element of trust, knowing that my manager trusts me to do my role and I as a manager trust others to do their role. But if they need something, I'm there for them. And that if there is another priority, because everyone has different priorities and different time pressures, we will find a way for that person or for me to be able to communicate with the manager. I think that's one of them. But also the well-being question, I think it cannot be spoken about too much. The best managers are the ones who think, how is my staff member going? Not just with the work, but what else is happening in their periphery? Are they looking after a sick child as well as trying to manage an emergency? What else is going on for them? And to know that in advance so that you can factor in, this person might need a bit of extra support here, and this person might be best placed to give them that support. Because the more everyone feels supported, the better we'll all be able to achieve whatever task it is.
You, Karl? Oh, sorry, Chantelle.
You're right. Oh, wait.
You go, Karl.
Look, I think they're really good points, Sascha. Probably a couple of sort of further thoughts on that. I think one of the key things for me is, does the leader have influence with the leadership of the wider response? And, it's a bit back to the seat at the table, Rebecca. And I think there's nothing more frustrating for PIM functions where they feel like they're banging their head against the wall because no one's kind of listening and don't understand. So, influence is key. I think the other thing, critical kind of leadership in this space, and back to the kind of theme of well-being for people and teams, is just being bold enough and brave enough to make the big calls. And sometimes that's actually pulling people out. I've certainly been in situations where people clearly, for a whole range of reasons aren't coping, and they really need someone just to come and say, look, I know you're doing your best, but we really need you to step back. Or even in a kind of I know in the council context, again, when we've gone out and supported regional responses, we've pulled people out because we just didn't feel they were able to be effective, and it was actually putting them a bit at risk, and causing them stress. So being able to make the big calls.
Chantelle?
Yeah, I agree. I think two major elements that you've both touched on ring true for me as well. So the first one is consistency. I think we need leaders who say this is what's going to happen, and then their actions meet their words. I know definitely, particularly with political pressure, we do find that there are some people who bend quite a lot to political pressure in an emergency, and that can be quite unhelpful at times if you've been led to believe that one thing is going to happen and you're operating in a certain way, and then all of a sudden there's that backflip in the middle of the emergency and it's not well communicated. It's really unhelpful. It causes a lot of confusion, and then people get angry as well. They don't feel well supported. So making sure you have that element of consistency, and that the leaders above you, if you're the leader trying to be consistent, that you also have the support of the people above you to do that. So making sure that groundwork is done before you say, this is what I'm going to do, and then tell your team. So making sure you're consistent, and then also having leaders that are people focused as well. So we all know that our intention is to communicate well with the community and give the community what they need, but that starts with our people as well. They're also often part of those communities. We all have lives. I know in our own team, we've got lots of people getting married, having babies, getting divorced. Like, there's a whole lot of life that happens around all of that. And we have made the mistake before of thinking that we are on the right track with all of that. We had an incident where it was a long-running, large-scale incident. One of our team members had a very, very young baby, only about 4 weeks old. They were also trying to work really hard. We thought we were very aware of balancing that quite right. They wanted to do everything right for our team, put in as much effort as everyone else, and they were striving to do that. And we ended up having a really bad health and safety incident with that person. And it was devastating as a leader of that team to think that I hadn't picked up on that. And I know my fellow managers felt exactly the same, because we really felt that we were on the pulse with it. And it provided a lot of lessons for us, that even though someone may be saying, I'm right, I'm okay, I can do it, I'm fine, that you really need to pay a lot more attention to those little nuanced bits and pieces that may indicate that that might not be the case. And that takes time, that takes knowing your people really, really well as well, which I think is one of the challenges when we're dealing with large scale incidents and people coming into our team who aren't normally in our team. There is a challenge behind knowing when they're not okay and picking up on that, because they're going to try and say they're okay for a lot longer than they should a lot of the time, because they want to help. We're all geared towards doing that. So making sure you're really aware of that's important.
Yes, it's interesting when you work in an emergency space, either operationally or as a communicator, that you can easily take on this identity of the helper, the solver, the hero, maybe even in the dark parts of our head that we wouldn't admit to. And we have got to be really careful that those stories don't stop us asking for help.
Yes.
And that definitely comes down to wellbeing. There is, Australian and New Zealand culture and American culture, most of the West are particularly bad at acknowledging mental health issues. And I know that all organisations are really having to look at that in a new light, in a more focused way. And that leads me to just one of the points made in the chat, which is COVID. COVID safe roles, skilled person may need to work from home. How has this changed looking after the well-being of our people? And I just want to get to one other question after that. So I want to talk to you about training, and we're coming to the end of our conversation, but just a few brief ideas about COVID, and then let's talk about training and exercising, because I sense that that's a massively important part of making us all ready to do this work.
In terms of COVID, the latest flood emergency that we had in Queensland, the entire media team for Queensland Fire and Emergency Services worked remotely for the entire event. It was the first time we had done anything like that, and COVID had helped us to be able to have all of our processes in place and procedures to be able to do that. It put people here at Kedron into a little bit of a spin for a while, because what do you mean you don't have any media people here to walk me to my interview with Channel 9 at 6 o'clock in the morning? That was the only thing we weren't able to do, was physically walk a person to their interview. But we did find that every single other role that we had to fulfill, we could fulfill remotely if we had to, which we did. Many of us were isolated, so we weren't able to travel into our workplace anyway. In terms of wellbeing, it did present a challenge because you don't see people face to face as much. But what we did do was we used Teams rather than Zoom. The first person on at 4:30 in the morning started a chat, like a phone call. Or video if people wanted. The more we went on, the less video there was, because the more tired people were. But it was like this, and they opened it at 4:30 in the morning, and it'd be closed at 10 o'clock at night, when we would go to just 2 people on for the night, and it would be open all day. And so we tried to simulate the office environment as much as we possibly could. Because then you could be a little bit more aware. Not only was it good for communication, where you could just pipe up and say, hey, Karl, are you online? Can I have a chat to you? It made it easier that way and limited emails, but it also meant that you could hear the little nuances in people's voices and what they were saying and how they were saying it. So you may not get all of the visual cues, but I feel like that was a really useful way for us to maintain as much as we could.
That's a great answer. Can I pass I think we've only got about 5 minutes left. So Karl, I feel like we could have a whole hour conversation about what makes excellent training and exercising and what really teaches us the lessons we need to learn. I'm thinking of what you said earlier, Chantelle, that we learn the lessons from our own difficult experiences, and somewhere in the back of my head is this line about wisdom is when you learn the lessons from other people's bad experiences. And I think exercises and training can help us do that. So just to touch on for you, Karl, what's some of the best training you've ever done?
Well, I was just going to open with something a bit facetious, Rebecca, and that was to just say, given the number of events that everyone seems to have to respond to, I wonder whether training's a bit redundant now, because it's kind of pretty much on the job, isn't it? Just about everyone I know in emergency media, etc., is responding virtually all the time. But look, I would probably not going to add any huge insights here because they're all sort of somewhat self-evident. One, come back to a team that is well supported. And it's really clear that they've got some ownership of the need to respond, and then support that with a regular process. So that is kind of, I think regular is better than regular and little, rather than deep and a lot. I don't think I've done a good job of describing that, but I think people get my meaning. And really maintaining it. So back to that PIM club model I mentioned at Auckland Council, that regular monthly kind of get together and check in and try and do things. The other thing I would say is, obviously the EMPA conferences are a good place for debriefs and lessons and insights, but just calling upon people from recent experiences and staying current on because it's a very evolving space, and staying current on what's working. And Chantelle, I love that idea, just in that wellbeing sense, creating that virtual team. Of keeping the channel open all day. What a great suggestion. So it's just a few thoughts from me there, Rebecca.
Thank you, Karl. And Sascha, we've got a minute.
Okay, I'm going to try to fit in two things in that minute. The first thing is, for good or bad, most of us are dealing with multiple hazards. So right now on the east coast of Australia, so many people are well versed in how to deal with floods. But in terms of training, don't forget that we don't have as much experience with some of the other hazards. So at the end of the bushfire season, I know with the Bureau of Meteorology, we undertook to train people in floods because everyone was so filled with bushfires. They knew how to handle bushfires, but they needed just simple reminders of here are how floods differ. So that's the first part. The second thing with training, and this comes down to debriefs, is it's always very, very tempting to nitpick different things that didn't work and to say that didn't work and that didn't work. I try to train myself and my team to instead say, here's what we could have done differently. So to go to an action that will help the future and be part of training people rather than just saying that didn't work, I didn't like that.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful place to end on. We are never going to get this perfect. If we try to, it is going to have an impact on our well-being. So we need to understand that as long as we do the best we can every day and learn a lesson every day and share those lessons with each other, that's a pretty good place to be. And as long as we accept that and continue connection, because that is essential to our well-being as well. So thank you to you three honest, opinionated and wise people for sharing your ideas and experiences today. There's a really lovely scroll of thanks happening on the chat. I think people really appreciated your openness. We do get the opportunity to learn from each other. That's one of the wonderful things about EMPA. So thank you all, and thank all of you for being here today, for your questions, for your comments, and we'll chat to you next time.
Thank you, Tay. Thanks, Rebecca. Nice job.
Thank you.
Yeah, well done.
Thank you for inviting me.
And good luck to everyone. You're amazing and you do a really important job.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. Hi everyone, for those still here, thank you very much to our presenters today, to Sascha Rundle, to Karl Ferguson and Chantelle Murphy, and of course Rebecca as our MC. Some great lessons from today, taking that time to rest and regroup, having those plans in place and making sure that it's not on the day, but it's actually stuff you get in place well in advance, learning from your mistakes and implementing those learnings as soon as the event is over. Having the right people in the role and in the team, making them feel valued and having the right structure in place, and of course, practicing and workshopping. So it's been a lot of great lessons for today and fantastic for all of us who've participated. Just a reminder, our next webinar is coming up with Dr. Rose Williamson from the University of New England. In the middle of the federal election campaign, what could be a better presentation than shining a spotlight on our federal and state politicians and their role in disasters and emergencies. So that'll be a really interesting and really exciting presentation for April. Please keep a lookout for that. And of course, if you enjoyed today, you'll enjoy the EMPA conference even more. From the 11th to the 13th of May, come along, lots of great learnings and lots of great people. We'll have John Brogden as our keynote and a real spotlight on mental health and well-being. We're also going to be looking at the climate for the next 10 years of the Bureau, emerging social media trends from the University of Queensland, an update on the Australian warning system from Amanda Leck, and we're going to have several sessions looking at community-led community engagement and communications, with the little town of Tumbulgin currently underwater on the Tweed, as well as Wallandilly Council, Glenalbo SES Progress Association and a few others. So an exciting program, lots more learnings, and we look forward to welcoming you to the EMPA conference in May. Please book now. Thank you.